Welcome everybody to the Keble debate, Thursday 18th of May, so you're in the right place at absolutely the right time. Subject today, the sonnet. The sonnet provokes extreme reactions. For some, the peak of poetic achievement, and for others, a dead end. When did it first begin to influence English literature? Why does it exercise such a pull on the imagination of poets? And does it remain in some way relevant for 20th and 21st century poetry? I'm absolutely delighted to be joined tonight by two old friends, or a very old friend and an old friend, by Christine Gerrard, chair of, well, we're a bit older than you, Christine, by Christine Gerrard, chair of the English faculty, and Vincent Gillespie, Emeritus Gerrard Tolkien Professor of English Literature and Language. By the 16th century, sonnets of an essayistic or meditative bent would deal more generally with objects of meditation. Sidney, Spenser, Daniel, Drayton. Shakespeare was, of course, different in his sonnets. Milton, too. Wordsworth and Keats were very much masters of the form. What started out as a form for love poetry has over 700 or 800 years or more broadened in subject matter and moved from introspection to religious devotion, elegiac mourning, political protest, philosophical reflection, and topographical description. It remains a powerfully condensed expression of rhyme and rhythm for eloquent, persuasive speech. The sonnet is a dualistic structure, formalizing the essence of drama in statement and response. In its origins in 13th century Sicily, the sestet of the Italian sonnet may have had a different music to that of the octave. A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E, or C, D, C, D, C, D, 8 lines plus 6 lines. The English sonnet in quatrains and couplets goes in a different direction. A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, G, G, in quatrains and couplets. Other English variants had between 12 and 18 lines in Elizabethan sequences, or 16 for Meredith. Others stretched the edge and rules, such as G.M. Hopkins, Kirtle sonnets, 6, 4.5. After the Romantic period, when an Italian octave and an English sestet became frequent, there followed a wide experimentation with rhythm structures and stretching the form. Also, I'm sort of the everyman here, throwing some light across the landscape before the two experts step up. Interesting also to look over the history of English literature to see those who wrote no sonnets whatsoever, such as Chaucer, Dryden, Pope, and those of the front rank who wrote few, such as Byron, Blake, and Browning. Coleridge isn't well represented, nor is Alfred Lord Tennyson. The Brontes wrote no sonnets, nor did Lawrence or Ted Hughes. Others, such as Eliot and Pound, wrote really bad sonnets for various reasons, which we can explore later. Shakespeare, a master of blank verse, wrote wonderful sonnets. Kit Marlowe, another master of blank verse, wrote none, sadly. As a habitual natural rebel in English literature, I prefer those who stretch the form to its full potential and sometimes beyond. As John Fuller once said, a good poem always emerges from a successful negotiation with form. Which if there's nothing else worthwhile I say this evening, I leave that thought with you. I'm just going to read one or two before handing over to the experts. We'll start with Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half shrunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command told that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty in despair." Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. I'm not going to read from John Donne. Do commend to you Death's Rebuke, and anybody wanting to explore Donne further, Catherine Randell's book on John Donne is absolutely outstanding, and comes highly commended. I'm now going to locate my friend. I've got that one somewhere. Here we have GM. Sorry for the painful delay. Here we go. The Windhover to Christ our Lord. I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled dawn-drawn falcon, in his riding of the rolling level, underneath him steadying air and striding. High there how he rung upon the rein of a wimpling wing in his ecstasy. Then off, forth on swing as a skate's heel sweeps smooth on a bow bend, the hurl and gliding, rebuffing the big wind. My heart in hiding stirred for a bird, the achieve of the mastery of the thing. Brute beauty and valour and act, O air, pride, plume, here, buckle, and the fire that breaks from thee, then a billion times told, lovelier, more dangerous, O my chevalier. No wonder of it, sheer plod makes plough down Scillian shine, and blue bleak embers, my dear, fall, gall themselves, and gash gold vermilion. And final one I'm going to read for the moment before handing over is my friend, the late, great Geoffrey Hill, Keble man, and his sonnet, Requiem for the Plantagenet Kings. For whom the possessed sea littered on both shores, ruinous arms being fired and for good to sound the constitution of just wars, men in their eloquent fashion understood. Relieved of soul, a dropping back of dust, their usage, pride, admitted within doors. At home, under caved chantries, set in trust, with well-dressed alabaster and proved spurs they lie, secure in the decay of blood marks, crowns hacked and coveted before the scouring fires of trial day, a light on men, before sleek groin, gored head, budge through the clay and gravel, and the sea across daubed rock evacuates its dead. Right, over to Vincent.
Thank you. It's interesting what Hopkins does with the sonnet. I think in those cases the GM stands for genetically modified, doesn't it? He changes the way the sonnet works as a sort of condensed, very powerful version. And that is quite striking, I think, that sense of playing with the underlying shape of a form. I think that underlying knowledge, underlying awareness of shape and form is one of the reasons why the sonnet has remained a perennial object of appeal and also a perennial challenge to poets. I think the discipline of the 14 lines is something that lots of poets want to explore and want to use as a kind of control on themselves. But of course, to some extent, it depends on an audience that's also aware of how sonnets work. There's no point in writing sonnets if your audience isn't able to be conscious of what you're doing with the sonnet form. I mean, for example, if I recite a short poem, can anybody tell me what genre this belongs to? There was a young fellow from Kent who was stung on the neck by a bee. When asked if it hurt, he said, "No, not much. It can do it again if it likes." That's a limerick, except it's not a limerick. It's an unlimerick. It's a non-limerick. And there are lots and lots. It's one of my favorite genres of mispoetry. There's another one which is slightly ruder, which is there was a young lady from Kent who went for a swim in a lake. A man in a punt put a pole in her ear and said, "You can't swim here, it's private." And the point about that is that knowledge and appreciation of that depends upon the audience being aware of what the rules are of a good limerick. And I don't mean an Edward Lear limerick where the last line is always the same as the first line, which is just a classic cop-out, really. So we're talking to some extent about a slightly hermetic relationship between an audience that is competent to see what's going on in a sonnet and a poet who wants to play with the structures of a sonnet and who's going to play with an audience's responses. There's a famous quote by John Fletcher in 1647 where he says, "If you be not reasonably assured of your knowledge of this kind of poem, lay down the book or read this, which I wish had been the prologue." And that's where he's telling people how the structures of his own poem works. The tradition of sonnet writing in English is to some extent cumulative and to some extent part of the kind of interlocution that goes on between poets of different generations, the sort of thing that T.S. Eliot talks about a lot in his amazing essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he says, "No poet, no artist of any art has his complete meaning alone. His significance, his appreciation, is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. You cannot value him alone. You must see him for contrast and comparison among the dead." And that sense that, to some extent, not only do the dead poets influence living poets, but to some extent, living poets influence dead poets. There's a wonderful conceit in David Lodge's terrific academic satire, Small World, where the hero, if you don't know Small World, it's one of the best spoofs of academic life, which features at its main campus the University of Limerick, that didn't exist until Charlie Hockey created the University of Limerick a few years after the book came out, which was a nice touch of life imitating art. But the main protagonist, it's a version of the Parsifal story. It's a version of the search for the Fisher King and the healing of the wasteland. And the hero is a man called Piers McGarrigle, whose thesis is the influence of T.S. Eliot on Shakespeare, which is not as stupid as it sounds, actually. I mean, it's the sort of thing that probably these days would be considered to be less unremarkable than it is. I mean, generic writing, intergeneric writing, depends a bit on what Jonathan Culler called years ago literary competence. That is, you need an audience that basically knows what the rules are and can respond to them. Just as if you're listening to a sonata, you have to know the basic structure of sonata form. If you're listening to 12-bar blues, you've got to know the basic shape of 12-bar blues. You're not going to appreciate it fully unless you have that sense of the underlying structural skeleton that's pinning the thing down. And so I think that sense of genre theory underpinning that buy-in from poets of every generation, really, is also linked to the fact that the sonnet in particular is an extreme example of what Don Patterson, in that remarkable essay that I've mentioned on previous occasions, calls the role of a poem as being a little machine for remembering itself. I think the structure of a sonnet particularly lends itself to that kind imaginative recall because it has the parameters laid out so clearly. And Patterson, interestingly, in 1999, published a book called 101 Sonnets. And he says in that, unity of meaning is an ideal that is impossible to represent in any sustained, linear, complex utterance. But it is what crazily our human poetry tries to do. So a sonnet is a paradox, a little squared circle, a mandala that invites our meditation. Of course, the problem about language is that it flattens and makes sequential and linear and chronological and subject to sequence a series of experiences, a series of feelings that might actually be much more intuitive, much more imaginative, much more the kind of imaginative syllogism that we've talked about on previous occasions. But Patterson's always believed that poetry, and particularly perhaps condensed structural poetry, is what he calls the dark art, because it changes the way we perceive the world, because it mystifies our experience. And that's why it's such an interesting, long-lasting survivor, I think, in the English literary tradition. Long-lasting, in a sense, right back to the first known translation of a Petrarch sonnet into English, which in fact is in Chaucer's Trawlers and Crusade in the mid-1380s, where Chaucer uses one of Petrarch's great canzonieri to articulate the paradox, the kind of emotional stasis, the freezing fire and burning ice of Troilus caught in this synapse of his love for Cressida. Now, what's particularly interesting about that is that although that's our first known translation of Petrarch within a few decades of Petrarch's own life, Chaucer doesn't do what he could have done, which is to translate it as a 14-line poem, as it is in the Italian, because Trawlers and Crusade is written in his high-style genre, which is called Rhyme Royal, which is a 7-line stanza that he uses for all his most elevated narratives. And so he could have easily translated the Petrarch into 2 7-line stanzas, and he'd have had the first actual structural parody of a sonnet. But in fact, he takes 3 stanzas to translate his Petrarch into English. So he's obviously more interested in the substance than he is in the formal element of the poem. And the first identified proper 14-line version of a sonnet in English actually comes a generation or so after Chaucer in the 1430s, where a poem appears from a relatively unknown poet that it does appear to be adhering to all the kind of Petrarchan rules. By that stage, English humanism is looking even more assertively to Italy, and it's quite possible that that is what's being picked up. So I've given you a handout with 2 examples of poems from different ends of the timescale. I just want to look a little bit in detail at both of them. And I'll start with the Seamus Heaney as a modern example, if I may. This extraordinary poem is one of the Heaney poems about the bog people, these preserved bodies that were dug up in Ireland. And he names it Strange Fruit after that extraordinary Billie Holiday song, Strange Fruit Up From Strange Tree, the story about the lynching, because this is a murdered girl. And so he's reflecting on that sense. So already he's setting up a kind of intertext. He's setting up a tension between the blues of Billie Holiday's song and the formality of the sonnet, and creating a sort of pull about oppression, suppression, punishment, etc., etc., etc. And one of the reasons why I thought it would be quite interesting to look at this is because this doesn't actually often play by the same rules as most sonnets do. It does in broad structural terms, that is, that it has the big distinction in a sonnet between the octave, the first 8 lines, which is, as it were, the proposition, and the sestet, which is the reflection on what's gone before it. So if you look at the poem, the line, Diodorus Siculus confessed his gradual ease, that's the beginning of the sestet. That's standing to one side from the actual description, whereas the previous 8 lines are part of the octave, of the propositional part of it. But there are all sorts of other ways in which this doesn't play by the rules at all. There's no typical rhyme scheme. There's none of these Petrarchan or Shakespearean rhymes that we've become familiar with from the sonetry tradition. And in fact, what he's looking at much more here is what you might almost call, following Day-Lewis, mouth music, because it's the noises. He's trying to recreate the kind of vegetable quality of this corpse as it's been exhumed from the wet peat bog. But there are other ways in which you can use the sonnet form quite healthily as a way of looking at something as if it's almost a scientific specimen. Here is the girl's head like an exhumed gourd, oval-faced, prune-skinned, prune stones for teeth. They unswaddled the wet fern of her hair. This is very difficult for a Liverpudlian to say, all these vowels, and made an exhibition of its coil. Let the air at her leathery beauty, pash of tallow, perishable treasure. Her broken nose is dark as a turf clod, her eye holes blank as pools in the old workings. You see how much of the work is actually being done by the noise? Pash of tallow, perishable treasure. You can almost hear the squelch of the wet peat as this comes through. And then the paradox, you remember Patterson talking about sonnets as paradox, they unswaddled something you do to a child, the wet fern of her hair, and made an exhibition of its coil. And the idiom to make an exhibition of something is to put it on show, but also to almost humiliate it. My mother used to be very fond of saying to me, you make an exhibition of yourself, she said quite frequently. So there's a whole series in which the language is pulling in all sorts of uncomfortable, uneasy directions, and the noises are replicating that. The noises are leading you into that sense of the fact that this is somehow not just physically marshy territory, it's morally marshy territory. It's uncomfortable. Let the air at her leathery beauty. The way the vowels move in that line is just wonderful, you know, but it's also that sense of vulnerability. This is something which has been preserved because it's in peat. Once it's in the air, unless it's conserved, it will disintegrate. So it's a tension in the language and so on. So the octave gives you that image, that slightly unsettling, that slightly uneasy portrait of this body as it's being exhumed from the peat bog. And then in the sestet, you get an altogether more, you might call distanced or academic or reflective attitude to it. Diodorus Siculus confessed his gradual ease among the likes of this. Diodorus Siculus was a Greek encyclopedist. He was a sort of collector of antiquities. And he confesses. So in one sense, this is a kind of adjunct. This is an indirect reflection on it. But he confessed his gradual ease among the likes of this. Is gradual ease a good thing or a bad thing? Are you meant to feel comfortable with something like this? Or is it actually something which is being defamiliarized by exposure in some ways? And then so the sestet continues, murdered, forgotten, nameless, terrible, beheaded girl, outstaring axe and beatification, outstaring what had begun to feel like reverence. And there's a sense in which he's almost avoiding the rhymes. He's almost avoiding any temptation to make a rhyme there. But that line, murdered, forgotten, nameless, terrible, and then the enjambment, the run-on to the next line, beheaded girl, outstaring axe and beatification, outstaring what had begun to feel reverence. The syntax is being distorted, whereas previously every line has been end-stopped, every line has been self-contained as a sense unit. When you get into the sestet, when you get into the reflective part of the poem, the syntax starts to skew, it screws slightly, so it starts to run over from one line to the next. Terrible beheaded girl, outstaring axe and beatification, outstaring what had begun to feel like reverence. And the syntax is showing you how the girl is outstaring you. She won't stay in the lines. She won't stay in the space. She's flowing out into something more challenging, and a feeling, what had begun to feel like reverence, clearly an inadequate reaction, clearly something that's not appropriate, clearly something that's as morally challenging, morally uncertain as the rest of the octave has shown you. So I think this is an extraordinary little piece of reflectiveness, if you like, using the sonnet form to create a piece of syntactical, lexical, phonological clockwork that moves the emotions and plays with your ears in lots of different ways, from the sort of squelchy marshiness to the sense of almost near reverence, near academic distance, in fact, of this specimen as it ends up in the museum. So I think that's a really interesting modern take on a sonnet form. But the other one I've given you, which is I'll just talk about relatively briefly before handing over to Christine, is one of the most famous of the 16th century sonnets, Sir Thomas Wyatt's Whoso Lists to Hunt, which is also a version of a Petrarch sonnet, Petrarch 190, but which is given a particular twist, if you like, by the fact that it's one of the poems that it's assumed is written about a putative relationship between Wyatt and Anne Boleyn, which is an extremely dangerous territory for Wyatt, who does end up in trouble, like almost everybody in Henry VIII's court ends up in trouble one way or another. And I think that this particular example is a remarkable product of what Greg Walker famously calls writing under tyranny, the sense of enormous psychological anxiety, pressure, neurosis that the utterly unpredictable environment of the Henrician court could produce in people who had to try and navigate their way through it and live and work in it in different ways. So I'll read this first, and then I'll take you on a kind of whistle-stop structural analysis of it, because as a piece of clock-making, there are a few sonnets, I think, in English that are better than this. As a piece of just sheer technical skill, it's quite extraordinary. Remember the major things you're looking out for in a sonnet of this period: the divide from 8 and 6, so the volta after line 8, where the poem slightly changes direction. The structural unit is often a quatrain or 3 quatrains and a couplet. And there's usually an interlocking rhyme scheme that sometimes turns in on itself. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is an hind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore, I am of them that farthest come behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer. But as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. I leave off, therefore, since in the net I seek to hold the wind. Who list our hunt? I put him out of doubt, as well as I may spend his time in vain. And graven with diamonds in letters plain, there is written half their neck round about. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. Caesar, of course, is Henry. The jewel is something that she's wearing around her neck. And words like wild and tame have quite strong sexual connotations in the lexis of this period. Now, if we just start at the kind of meta-structural level and look at the kind of octave and sestet divide here, it's interesting that unlike the Heaney, where the sestet goes and looks at the object from a slightly different perspective, in a sense what happens here is that the kind of recursive paranoia represents itself by the repetition of the line. Whoso lists to hunt, I know where is a hind in line 1. Who list her hunt? I put him out of dite. So there's not a sense in which this is changing position. It's coming back in this kind of slightly obsessive way to replicate the position, the subject position of the speaker of the poem. Now, I said 8 and 6 is your unusual division, but a sonnet is 14 lines. So the natural place to break 14 lines is halfway through line 7. If you look halfway through line 7, the poem actually does stop. Yet I may by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer, but as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow, stop. I leave off, therefore. So in fact, he's introduced a new structural division, which is the exact midpoint, the exact syntactical and metrical midpoint of the poem. And that's the point at which he appears to be renouncing her. So that's another undertow of structure that's working there. And then if you go down to the next level, you've got the quatrains, which are rhyming A, B, B, A, which have a kind of curious, recursive lack of progress, if you like. Whoso list a hunt, I know where is a hind. But as for me, alas, I may no more. The vain travail hath wearied me so sore. I am of them that farthest cometh behind. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer. But as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. And what's interesting in that is because you've got the A, B, B, A rhyme repeated, the last A of the first quatrain becomes a match or a couplet with the first A of the second quatrain. So it's like the link in a chain. It carries you through, and it creates this kind of chiming effect between the different elements there along the way. So there's a sort of circularity, and there's a sense of almost a kind of ponding of anxiety on the surface of the poem, where he's not really able to make any kind of linear progress through that. And then a slightly lower level of structure, the way in which in lines 5 and 6 and 6 and 7, the hunt is dramatized by the enjambment, by the running on between the lines. Yet may I by no means my wearied mind draw from the deer. And again, it's beautiful the way that the rhythm falls on the first syllable of that next line. But as she fleeth afore, fainting I follow. And the sense in which he's always, as it were, round the corner. He can't quite keep up with her. He can't quite see her. That the syntax and the pursuit is bending out of shape in somehow. I leave off, therefore, synth and a net. I seek to hold the wind. And then you can go a lower level, and you can just look at the structural couplets. Obviously, the final couplet, the emblem that's written on the stone round the neck. Noli me tangere, for Caesar's I am, and wild for to hold, though I seem tame. But actually, there are lots of other inadvertent couplets that are creating chimings that are going off in different ways. And so there are all sorts of technical things going on there. And then down at the most basic level, in addition to the sense of the couplets and the quatrains, almost every line here is a sense unit. You can actually take each line almost as self-contained, apart from those enjambments, which are more dramatic because they're unexpected in some way. And so what you've got here, I think, is the claustrophobia of a poem being produced in a locus and an emotional and political environment of extraordinary labyrinthine constraint. And it's somehow being articulated not just in what the poem says. If somebody had Thomas Wyatt on the end of a toasting fork at the Tower of London, he'd just say it's just a version of Petrarch 190. But in fact, the work is being done really down at the level of the structure, down at the level of the syntax, down at the level of the form. And that's the beauty of the sonnet. I think that's the great skill of the sonnet, is that it allows, in a really concentrated way, our consciousness, our imaginations to be played with in ways that actually manipulate and give us things to meditate on, as Patterson says. Sorry to go on for so long.
No, that's absolutely wonderful. And I yet again regret that when I did my modest 3 years of English here, I wasn't fortunate enough to be taught by you. I was a hard case and was beaten and shaped by the venerable Dorothy Bednar, who's yes, a very scary lady. Right.
She had more gin than I did, though, let's face it.
Yes, certainly, yes, that's true. I've rarely merited a glass.
Oh, it's teacup, dear boy, teacup.
Teacup. Christine.
Yes, so in response, I think, to many of the excellent things that Vincent has said. So I'm in quite an odd position here, because the period that I do most of my research in, which is the period sort of 1660 to about 1740 to 50, is one, in fact, where writers rarely write sonnets. It's interesting that I think the general depreciation of the sonnet in that period is linked to an idea that it is over-intricate, that it's attached to formal rules, that it's Elizabethan, Gothic, that's the word they used. I found a funny little mock sonnet by Daniel Ray, written in this period where it ends. He says, "Courage, another will finish the first triplet, thanks to thee, muse. My work begins to shorten. There's 13 lines got through, driblet by driblet. 'Tis done. Count how you will. I warrant there's 14. So they disliked the rule-bound nature of the sonnet. And it's only really that the sonnet starts to take off again in the Romantic period, which I'm currently working on with my own undergraduates this term. And I was very interested, Hamilton is in the audience, and he found some slavery sonnets, some anti-slavery sonnets. And I thought that thematically that was quite interesting, because I feel that not only is the sonnet a very popular form in the Romantic period, because writers start to look inwards again, and a lot of it is about constraint, but I feel that in political terms, those sonnets are rather intriguing, that they think about real forms of constraint and imprisonment shackled within the 14 lines. So, I mean, in a way, what I suppose I'd like to say is that the sonnet is alive and well, and that it has gone through over the centuries a number of different permutations and changes. When I used to teach the early Renaissance period, including Wyatt and Surrey, as we used to do in those days, we then moved into sonnet sequences, which we haven't actually talked about, where you make the individual engine of the sonnet linked like pearls in a chain to other sonnets. So there was a great vogue for sonnet sequences in the 1590s with works such as Sir Philip Sidney's Astrophil and Stella, I think of 1592, Edmund Spenser's Amoretti of 1595, and then later on a sonnet sequence by a woman writer related to Sidney, Lady Mary Roth, Pamphylia to Amphilanthus. And those do interest me very much, because coming back to the point that Vincent raised about audiences and readership and knowing the form, I think at its worst, the sonnet sequence is a type of showing off to other men. I'm sorry to say this, but I feel that a lot of the sonnets, unlike, say, Wyatt's, which Vincent's spoken about so brilliantly, are quite extensive pretexts for writing about one's own poetic ambitions, which are to some extent thwarted by, I mean, Sidney also, like Wyatt, I think, fell under Elizabeth's jurisdiction, so he was unable to have quite the career that he wanted. But they are very, very exhibitionist as poems, and you have to know the form to see, as he writes, however many it is in that sequence, just how starry they are. You know, they're very much look-at-me kind of sonnets. Biting my thumb, beating my breast for spite, fool, says my muse to me, look into thy heart and write. The question of sincerity in those sonnets, I think, is a matter of, I don't know, some doubt perhaps. There's always the Petrarchan pretext that, you know...
It's like Hamlet not being able to write a sonnet for
Yeah.
Ophelia.
And then just sort of does, you know, these extraordinary pyrotechnics of sonnets. He shows you, I mean, I think Vincent would be able to do this better than I can, but, you know, analysing the various forms that he moves through, it's like a little showcase of sonnets. So rather extraordinary, I think. I mean, to me, actually, that working in the later period has actually been, I think, very, very revealing. I don't have an enormous amount to say about this subject, but I was interested in what you said about, we talked about it a little earlier, about the sonnet being perennially attractive because of its I think its flexibility. I mean, I think when you were reading The Windhover, and you won't remember that when I first knew you, that was a poem that I recited a lot. So, because I fell in love with Gerrard Manley Hopkins when I was an undergraduate reading English, and I thought that was extraordinary, its experimentalism. I think, Vincent, you've shown actually with the Heaney poem just how far you can go with something that isn't tightly rhymed. It's very extraordinary. But you used the phrase, a little machine for remembering, which I find really interesting. I'm particularly interested in memorising poems, and I wondered whether we've lost that to some extent, and whether, in fact, the way the sonnet's put together actually, not only does it enable people to think about constriction and imprisonments of an emotional kind, a political kind, an ethnic kind, actually, as well, but whether it's also something that kind of moves itself on through the various stanzas, or not the stanzas, through the lines, through from through into the sestet, you know, the volta, the turn. One of my favourites, I could read, I could recite. I don't know if I can remember this off by heart, but it's a poem by Robert Frost, so quite late. Originally drafted in 1912 and was then called All White, or In White, I think. And it's a poem that changed, possibly, through Frost's experience of World War I. So published in 1918, at the end of the war, which was then called Design. I love the title, Design, because I feel that in a way encapsulates the design of the poem, but it's also about a much darker kind of design, which I think Frost saw the maker of the world being engaged in. I'd like to try it off by heart, but I probably won't manage it, so I'll start. And it goes like this. I found a dimpled spider, fat and white, on a white heel all, holding up a moth, like a white piece of rigid satin cloth, assorted characters of death and blight, mixed ready to begin the morning rite, like the ingredients of a witch's broth. A snowdrop spider, a flower, like a froth, and dead wings carried like a paper kite. What had that flower to do with being white, the wayside blue, and innocent heel all? What brought the kindred spider to that height? What steered the white moth through the night? What but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? And I find this a powerful poem because it works through a triplet conjunction of objects, almost like a triptych, how you pronounce it, of the spider, the white spider, which is like a baby, hideous, you know, dimpled and fat and white. The frothy white flower, which shouldn't be white at all, it should actually be blue, but it's bleached out somehow. And then the moth, the spider has actually caught the moth in its mouth, and the moth is also white, so it's three white things in conjunction. And what's sort of clever about it, I think, is that the poet draws this a triptych to our attention, this bleached white thing. The last line of the octet, before we get to the sestet, is, "and dead wings carried like a paper kite," which only rhymes with the first line of the sestet. What had that flower to do with being white? So that's the kind of machine on which it turns in the Volta, basically, into an investigation of the meaning of the universe through some small collocation of natural objects, which then seem frighteningly to enlarge into a kind of symbolic version of what has gone wrong with the world, a world that's been bleached to its colour, a world of rapacity, of vindictiveness and of death, really. The line, if design govern, what but design of darkness to appall, if design govern in a thing so small? Is it worse if there is a design or if there's no design? I think that question is left at the end. And modern sonnets or recent sonnets can be powerful. I think it's still a very vital form. I was interested when you were reading Ozymandias that in a way this sonnet and that sonnet and also Strange Fruit enable the sonnet to make us look at things, a collocation of objects, in strange ways. I mean, they bring a perspective to bear upon a group of items that look different to us somehow. And that seems to me, one of the sort of brilliant things about the sonnet, that they make the familiar strange at their very best. So I don't really have a lot more to say. I mean, other than, that romantic sonnets obviously are a mode that is deeply popular. The one I'd maybe like to end with, again thinking about making the familiar strange, is Charlotte Smith's, written in the churchyard at Middleton Stony. I don't know if people know Charlotte Smith's writing. So she had a very difficult life, many children, an abusive marriage. She wrote a lot for money, novels, one of which we were doing earlier in a tutorial today, and numerous sonnets. So the elegiac sonnets are a kind of almost hybrid form of the elegy and the sonnet. I mean, women often wrote elegies, but her sonnets are interesting. And they draw on that topographical tradition that you've mentioned, which becomes popular at the end of the 18th century with people like Samuel Lyle Bowles. But this is somewhat Shakespearean, but in quite a good way, I think. So I will read it. So sonnet 40, sorry, I'm trying to do my Roman numerals. Sonnet 44, that's it, got it, right. Written in the churchyard at Middleton Stony. Pressed by the moon, mute arbitress of tides, while the loud equinox its power combines. The sea no more its swelling surge confines, but o'er the shrinking land sublimely rides. The wild blasts rising from the western cave drive the huge billows from their heaving bed, tears from their grassy tombs the village dead, and breaks the silent Sabbath of the grave. With shells and seaweed mingled, on the shore, lo, their bones whiten in the frequent wave. But vain to them the winds and waters rave. They hear the warring elements no more, while I am doomed, by life's long storm oppressed, to gaze with envy on their gloomy rest. So there's a kind of echo in that poem of Gray's elegy written in a country churchyard, very popular male poem written in around 1750, I think, and where you have a silent or a quiet graveyard. And this is a graveyard by the liminal space of the coast filled with a kind of elemental violence where the villagers are not allowed to rest, tears from their grassy tombs the village dead and breaks the silent Sabbath of the grave. But there's also a kind of echo somewhere here of the tempest, with shells and seaweed mingled on the shore, lo, their bones whiten in the frequent wave. One thinks of those are pearls that were his eyes. It's quite strange. And And I think that that turn at the end towards this kind of misery and unhappiness, which Charlotte Smith undoubtedly feels, is very characteristic of her writing. The inwardness and the enabling facility of the sonnet to talk about those states, which she wasn't really allowed to do in other places, I find is a particularly female form of writing, and I think she's a really powerful writer of sonnets. So that probably is where I will end. Thank you.
Well, that's great. Christine, thanks very much. Yes, it's interesting. There's the same echoes of violence towards past misdemeanors that Geoffrey refers to in the Requiem for Plantagenet Kings, because it starts off and you think it's going to be an elegy, and it turns into real rage at the way that the landscape and people were maimed as a result of political ambition, and the few that hack their way up to the top sort of have their chantries, even if they lose it. But there's that way of turning and looking at the past and saying, actually, my requiem for you guys is you did a hell of a lot of damage in a nutshell, and I don't like it. I think fascinating what you're saying about remembering poetry, because just thinking back to studying Latin poetry, what helps you remember that is that tremendous driving rhythm, quadruped antipatrandum quanitus, ungula campum, that tremendous sort of driving rhythm that drives those Latin verses onwards, and perhaps when most people didn't read, we had a greater capacity to remember things and remember poetry in that way, and rhyme came along to sort of help, but it's just small gobbets that we remember now. I remember I could recite all of Kubla Khan while brushing my teeth, but those things you lose. Well, maybe not brushing my teeth terribly well, but
it's not great for your diction doing it.
No, not great for diction either, is it? No. Better to put the toothbrush down or throw it at the wasp or whatever.
It's like those musical, where you have a dummy that reads from A to Z or something while you drink a pint of beer.
Yeah, no, I was made to read out, a long time ago at school, I was made to read out poetry by way of punishment, which I thought was actually rather a good punishment. It was much better than being flogged or having to write one line out many, many times.
When my father-in-law was in the very last stages of dementia, the last things that he could remember were the poems he'd been taught as a boy in school in Ireland in the 1920s. And he could still recite great swathes of Goldsmith and people like that. Everything else had gone. He didn't know his own name. He didn't know where he was. He didn't know who his family were. But the poetry was still hardwired into his memory. It was extraordinary, I think.
Yes, we don't do as much of that as I wish we would. Both my sons were at a school where they had annual poetry contests and they had to learn poems off by heart for this. And I think learning poetry is incredibly useful. But it's also kind of good for you because you carry the poem around inside you, and you can take comfort from it actually at times that you need it.
That's one of the things I wanted to pick up on when you were talking about the sonnet sequences. I think sonnet sequences are a really interesting cultural phenomenon. I mean, there is a kind of earlier Middle English sonnet sequence, which is the Middle English Pearl, which is a sequence of 101 12-line stanzas, which is the kind of weird English pseudo-ballad that only seems to exist for about 30 years. But the sonnet sequences, I mean, John Buxton used to claim that, in fact, people in the Countess of what's her name, Mary Sidney's circle, they used to go away for sonnet writing weekends. He claimed that they'd go away and they'd be, before dinner they'd say, right chaps, we're going to write a sonnet on my mistress's eyes or something like that, and then they'd compare it and they'd award a prize for. And there are certainly, if you go through the contemporary sonnet sequences, you can see patterns of poems that appear to be, honour whatever a topic might be.
Yeah.
But the other thing that, I mean, the thing about the consolation that you mentioned, which I think is something that we ought to throw into the mix here, is that a sonnet sequence is very like the Psalms. I mean, Shakespeare's sonnets are almost exactly the same length as the Book of Psalms. And there is a sense in which a long sequence of sonnets performs a similar kind of discursive psychodrama that the Book of Psalms does, in terms of, you know, the movement from anger to grief to loss to anxiety to fear, whatever it might be, that they are snapshots of different emotional states.
Yes.
And I think the pressure of the Psalms on English poetry of that kind all the way through is actually quite strong in the first 200 or 300 years of sonnet writing.
And Sidney, of course, it's interesting you say that. I hadn't really thought about that, but Sidney himself, of course, in the Defence of Poetry, or an Apology for Poetry, actually is a great admirer of the Bible as poetry.
Absolutely.
And writes
Wyatt
about
and
it.
Surrey both do psalm translations.
Yeah. And indeed, and Wyatt's are amazing, really.
Yeah.
His penitential psalms, that's it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Surprised by joy, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah.
That comes from there, yes. It's
You use the word joy, but what I think is remarkable, going back to J.M. Hopkins, who has been my main man for many years, is just that he had to write these on his own. He wasn't sure if he was allowed to. He wasn't sure if anybody was ever going to read them. And there's large parts of it, of his writing, in which he feels a tremendous conflict with his fundamental religious belief. You know, should he, and the question almost comes out, should I be writing these things? Because some of these things are expressing emotions that almost run contrary.
Yeah, it's interesting, you're right. And in fact, we should have mentioned the terrible sonnets, because
Yes.
those are very extraordinary. You know, no worse there is none, pitch past pitch of grief, thoughts against thoughts in groans grind. I mean, it's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
And you know, again, pushing the boundaries of loss and fear and guilt. They're very powerful. If those of you who haven't read Gerrard Manley Hopkins, let me enjoin you to go and read him, because when, you know, I don't know whether he is read as much as he once was. Certainly when Robin and I were both students, we definitely read Hopkins.
Yeah.
Yes.
I feel like the third wheel in the Gerrard Manley Hopkins fan club here, I must say.
And I remember, actually, it was reward for good behaviour. I was allowed by Dorothy Bednaroska to go down to Campion Hall with a chit from her to have a look at some of the original manuscripts,
That's right.
which they had. I don't know if they still have, but it's most remarkable. And
I mean, there is a slight sense, isn't there, at various points in literary history, that writing the sonnet marks you out as a poet with a capital P. And that you're, you know, I mean, you're Mary Smith, that intertextuality there.
Charlotte Smith.
Charles.
Yep.
I mean, that intertextuality, it's a little, you could argue that it's a little bit mannered, that it's actually somebody sitting there with their you know, their finger on their chin saying, I'm now going to be a poet. And I think that happens in later centuries.
But I
maybe
think
more.
that's very true of the Romantic period as a whole. I don't think it's because she's a woman writing sonnets, actually. I think that self-consciousness about being a poet, of course, is what characterises many writers. Keats, I mean, is brilliant. I mean, when I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, the famous Keats sonnet. So they do think a lot about that.
Yes.
And it is stylised to some extent.
Absolutely. No, I think that's right. I think it's almost a sort of rite of passage in a way, isn't it? That you have to prove your chops like that.
the current chair, poetry professor, Alice Oswald, has written a sonnet, quite a good one, called Sea Sonnet, in this excellent collection of the Oxford Book of Sonnets, which I commend. But yeah, I think it is a tradition that many people put their shoulder to the wheel on, and for some it's mannered, and for some the rage of Plantagenet kings is barely contained within the form of the sonnet.
It's parodied from an early stage, though, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I'm just remembering now, because I know I did do it. I'm trying to think as an undergraduate. So it's sixth form, Love's Labour's Lost. That's filled with, isn't it? Oh, you've got this right. It's filled with people wandering around with sonnets,
yes.
and as you like it as well. It's
yes.
the same kind of thing. That there's something sort of almost not ridiculous, but the idea of the languishing youth, you know, who walks around with a sonnet, you know, which he pins to the tree, and, you know, you've got that slightly mannered quality to it.
It's a bit of Blackadder lurking in the background,
Yeah,
isn't there, somewhere
yeah.
along the way? I think that's right.
Yeah.
I think, and it's a bit like, you know, I mean, academic musicians, certainly the ones that were contemporary with me, they spent a lot of their time writing pastiche. They had to write, you know, string quartets in the style of Brahms, or a symphony in the style of Beethoven, or whatever it might be, and they learn the structure, they learn the discipline from within. And a sonnet is obviously one of those genres that people feel they need to master in some way, to get into in some way, to prove themselves as members of the fraternity or the confraternity.
Love to have got Marlowe to write a sonnet or two.
Yeah.
Been just fascinating to see.
Back to the rude limericks again, I
Yeah,
suspect, probably.
yeah. I think he'd have really let fly in all directions. I think he was very.
It's interesting. I'd like to just revert back to that idea of why, you know, in your list of writers, people in that sort of 18th, sort of 17th Restoration to kind of the Augustan period, why they didn't write sonnets, and was it just to do with the form, or was it to do with writing poetry about inwardness? There isn't a lot of poetry about inwardness in that period. Poetry is a sociable form, it's a public form. The modes that they most liked really were obviously rhyming couplets.
Yeah.
The heroic couplet, used loads and loads, very good for remembering, of course. And also blank verse. I mean, so you oscillate between those two forms. And longer poems as well. They don't really like short poems. I mean, the 18th century is a capacious period, and, you know, they love long poems. And satire as well, which kind of militates against intensity of emotion. So it just seems not to come up in that time very much at all, except in a mocking way, because they thought Spenser was funny, and they laugh at Spenser. So any Spenserian imitation is sort of ridiculous, really. It's not sincere, which is quite strange.
We've had a great time up front, but we're very keen to share any thoughts in the audience. I'm spoilt to have these two good friends with me, and I've indulged myself. But has anybody got any thoughts they'd like to add, or questions they'd like to ask to the two professors? Do pop a hand up, or just speak. If there's anything that's been stirred up by today's debate. Jenny, have you got something you'd like to say from the back? Geography shouldn't limit you in any way, shape, or form. It may have been a convenient subject without practicals, so that you could get 9 major blues and not have to go and do practicals in the afternoon. But no, I'm sure professors of poetry here have been geographers, Jenny. I can't think of any, but any.
Hamilton.
I like when you speak about the Renaissance sonnets, and I just kind of, when I was reading Ashes in a Cellar, and there was a lot of you say it's very highly, like, you know, self-reflective and it's conscious artist and things like that. There was a lot of stuff about desire kind of being like uncontainable and almost like exceeding form, and I kind of thought there was something ironic about it, putting that into such a highly wrought form. But then I read something from Samuel Daniel, which is like, it's kind of in that environment that was really pleasing, that you sometimes in art, you know where to end, but like with the sonnet, it's a prescribed form, you enter into it knowing, you know, it has to end. And I just thought how much, you know, of the sonnets that you guys have encountered are just really personal. Is there anything about the sonnet that would be more inherently personal?
I mean, certainly Petrarch, the Petrarchan tradition is about being hung on the horns of a paradox. And so they're very rarely expecting a resolution or the achievement of fulfillment of a relationship. So a lot of the time it's about the agony rather than the process. actually, and I think there's, you know, in a way, that goes back to that old shibboleth of courtly love, the idea that fin amour, fin loving, as it is in Middle English, that it's about an interrogation of your own internal oxymorons, rather than actually any attempt to and of course a sonnet is useful in that sense because it doesn't necessarily have a kind of linear resolution. It's just a snapshot of a moment in emotional time.
And it's also about unrequited and unrequitable desire so often, and that's where you have the wonderful kind of tension between sort of the tight form and the kind of yearning that the sonnet so often expresses, which I think makes it a really interesting mode for all kinds of expressions of illicit love, basically, as well. Illicit in the sense that obviously Sidney, you know, was very keen on Penelope Rich, you know, but she was married to somebody else, so he couldn't express that. There's all kinds of things that you can do with sonnets, actually. And they're so often about pain. That's the trouble. I mean, the sonnet is actually a very unhappy form at times. They're not jolly poems. You know, they are about unhappiness a lot of the time, I think.
Well, Donne talks about fettering my love in verse, doesn't he? I mean, it's that idea of partly the sense of the chafing of form and experience.
I mean, he has that strange line in the canonisation, we'll build in sonnets pretty rooms, as well, a well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs. But it's pretty rooms doesn't quite get it, does it, you know?
Isn't there a smile on Shelley's face at the end of the poem as he absolutely captured somebody, you know, who ultimately we will have contempt for, you know, in their own creation. He's encapsulated in it. I feel him ending with a smile.
Oh, yeah.
Isn't he?
You mean Ozymandias?
Ozymandias,
It's
yes.
brilliantly ironic, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a smile on his face at the end. But as you say, so often, pain, unrequited love, and again, Hopkins, the sort of these extraordinarily strong emotions that are spilling over into the language and stretching the language so far.
There's a very funny, just to throw in the idea of kind of pain and unrequited love. There's a section in book 6 of the Fairy Queen, I'd forgotten about this, and there's a character called Mirabella, who is the sonnet queen, and I suppose she might be modelled a bit on Elizabeth I. She's so beautiful, but so proud, and she has many suitors who write endless numbers of sonnets for her. And all of them sort of, a bit like Zuleika Dobson, they all kind of throw themselves in the river because she doesn't return their love. So it's about unrequited love and about poems that are filled with unrequited love. But she is punished in this poem by being made to seek the love of a good man, and she can't find it, basically. So it's kind of a little sort of message about courtly love in there, which is really, really interesting, and about unrequited love. Little moral allegory, basically, in the longer poem, which is interesting. Yeah.
Wonderful. Jenny, oh yes, absolutely, far away.
What do you think about the Keats sort of idea about no good sonnets ever written at the end of a rhyming couplet? Particularly on the grounds that Keats is fantastic sonnets do end with rhyming couplets.
I don't know. I mean, that one certainly does, doesn't it? On the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. So that's a good example. But was that a general axiom that he held? Yeah.
One of those ones which you've heard that every song that you read ends with a couplet, you think, does that prove Keats or does it not?
Yeah.
Often I think it does.
But lots and lots of sonnets end in couplets, actually. And often that's in Donne's sonnets, that's often the couplet at the end is really, really important. Takes it in a different direction. But he didn't like rhyming couplets, probably, because that was a very 18th century, earlier, Augustan form, really. Yeah.
It must be very difficult to resist the pull of that final couplet, mustn't it? I mean, I think if you know, it's, I mean, if you think of the Donne, what if this present were the world's last night?
Yeah.
Where the last line is, this beauteous form assures a piteous mind. And he's talking about the sonnet.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a beauteous form which has that effect of on you. But it's that sense of the inevitable trajectory towards the couplet.
And you can do so much with the rhyming couplet at the end, because it can be ironic,
Yeah,
as you
you
know,
can
or
turn it.
go off at a tangent, as Donne so often does, actually, and kind of, yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm struggling to think of people writing good sonnets for comic effect. I sometimes have to admit I laugh at some of the attempts at sonnets by T.S. Eliot and Signor Pound,
Oh dear.
which I just think are terribly, terribly bad.
There were two books that I used to cherish, and when I retired I had to let go. One was the Faber Book of Parodies, which is full of wonderful spoofs. And the other is a collection that's almost impossible to find these days, which is called The Stuffed Owl.
Oh, wow.
And The Stuffed Owl is an anthology of bad poetry. I mean, one of the problems with literature degrees is you don't read enough bad poetry. You don't read enough bad literature generally, because there's a canon which has kind of, put things through the kind of colander of literary assessment. But The Stuffed Owl was the most amazing collection of absolute rubbish, and it was a thrill to be able to settle down with it.
Gosh, we've made some...
I think doing a degree here actually spoils your taste for bad literature.
Yeah,
I
absolutely,
definitely
that's
think
right.
Oh, dear.
I mean, it's very hard. When you finish finals, you get to that point and you think, right, I'm going to go and read some rubbish. And then, of course, you pick it up and you just can't, because you think, this is terrible. No, it doesn't work.
The only difference about the Faber Book of Parodies was that all the Wordsworth in it was actually genuine Wordsworth. It wasn't parodies.
Not much Coleridge in there, I suspect.
No.
Certain standards have to be maintained. Goodness me, what a joy. Well, we will be back doing poetry again next academic year, most probably next year. Just a quick pipe for the next Keble debate, where Vincent and I will be interviewing Camilla, Nicholas Shakespeare, as he has just completed, and the proofs have been done, his authorised biography of Ian Fleming. And actually the Keble debate is going to be the kind of his part of his UK PR whistle stop. So he's not going to do Blackwell's or Waterstones. He's going to do the Keble debate and sign some books afterwards. And it's being released in time for A, Christmas, and B, Thanksgiving, both of which apparently are significant events. So that will be the kind of the novel, as it were, for next term. But we will be back with more poetry, and I hope all three of us again, plus maybe in the guest reader next year on poetry as well. But thank you very much for joining in. And can I thank the two professors who've given us a lot of food for thought.